You're listening to Dear Gen Z, real stories, raw advice, and timeless lessons from the generations before us. Each week, we sit down with someone who's lived a little longer to bring you insights on life, love, purpose, and everything in between. Because sometimes the best advice doesn't come from social media, it comes from those who've been there.
Hey guys, welcome back to Dear Gen Z. I'm your host, Sean Modi, and today we're diving into something that can feel a little bit overwhelming, confusing, and honestly pretty stressful: the college admissions process. From essays and interviews to extracurriculars and test scores, there's so much advice out there that it can be hard to know what actually matters. To help us cut through the noise, I'm joined by Joshua, the head of Hill House Admissions, who has helped countless students navigate this process and land at their dream schools. Today, we're going to break down the strategies, insights, and the behind-the-scenes tips that can help you stand out and make the admissions process work for you. Josh, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
Yeah, so to kick things off, I'd just love for you to share a little bit about your background and how you got into the world of college admissions.
Yeah, sure. Um, my process into college admissions was a bit more gradual than probably most. I never expected that I'd be, you know, starting and doing, boutique admissions consulting and coaching. But I'd say the pinnacle moment was probably a little bit over a decade ago. Was when I was in high school actually, and I was asked to tutor a friend's little brother in writing, and he believed that he wasn't so great at writing, and he was pretty talented at math. And I remember sitting down with him and saying, "Okay, well, if you think you're good at math, and he probably was good at math, I just never checked, um, we can kind of figure out how to write in a way that is constructed as if it were math." So then what we did was we went and we looked for really nice sounding sentences, very aesthetic, pretty sentences that we liked, that we thought were very appealing, and impactful. And we stripped those sentences of their ideas, and then used them as templates. And I said, okay, now if you're ever short of an idea in an essay, you don't know what to say, take one of these sentence structures and just let your brain fill in an idea that fits the structure of the sentence. And you fast forward, he started doing that. He started getting really good at writing. I graduate, I go to college, and I get an email from him a couple, you know, years into college saying, "Hey Josh, I know we haven't spoken in a couple years, but I was just accepted into Cornell, and one of the most important and foundational pieces of this puzzle for me has been the foundation you helped me establish in writing." That feeling is just one of the best feelings. And since then, I've kind of touched every really part of the admissions process, from you know, tutoring English, SAT, standardized tests, to personal statement writing and development, narrative development, and ultimately extracurricular strategy and overall strategy to college admissions. Having also worked at a couple of other education companies like Bulldog Tutors and Huntington Learning over the years. And so that's how I kind of got into this. And I tend to have strong opinions. So that led me here to what I'm doing right now.
That's awesome. And you mentioned the different kind of things that you help students with. You mentioned tutoring for the SAT, ACT for your standardized tests. You mentioned
Yep.
the essays, the extracurriculars. So I just want you to quickly break down, maybe for people who aren't so familiar with the admissions process, maybe how applications are evaluated, the different parts that go into making something, and maybe what really matters most in your opinion.
Huh? Yeah, I think there's a lot of noise, and a lot of things to keep track of, that some people say one thing's important, another person will say another thing's important. I think you have to first kind of just distill it simply, and just think about what really ultimately matters is your ability to tell a story to and someone else's ability to interpret that story in a way that creates resonance. And so that narrative is kind of, you could probably, I'd say, think of it in terms of, if you break that down into things that are controllable and then some intangible factors. So the things that are controllable, right, those are your grades, your extracurriculars, your SAT, and even your personal statement to an extent. Though the personal statement does have a bit of an intangible element. And what do I mean by intangible? Well, I mean, you have to think about your college application and parts of it almost like art, right? Art makes you feel something. Your college application is supposed to make somebody who's reading it feel something. And that's the approach that I like to take is if you treat it aesthetically and like art, it's hard to go wrong.
Right. And I feel like a big thing of that is the authenticity, right? Because a lot of kids, like I've heard a lot of people say that people try to mold their story and their narrative into what they think a college wants to hear. Like it's a common saying, like, tell me what I need to hear, not what I want to hear. So that's something that people really mess up. And I want you maybe to talk on that a little bit. Like, what are one to two of like the biggest myths that students believe really matters in the admissions process that like maybe they have the wrong conception of?
Yeah, it's a good question. And your point on authenticity is, hits the nail on the head. Authenticity is the name of the game. And the thing about authenticity is if you're trying to be authentic, you're probably doing it wrong. Um, it's it's a balance of not doing those cringe things where you're kind of trying to back into what you think someone wants to hear, but instead doing the things that you like and saying the things that you want to hear, what you want to say. As it relates to, I guess, myths in the admissions process, one that I see a lot is when they give you a word maximum or a word count, right? On like a essay or personal statement. I've had parents, the student with my help writes a wonderful essay that's 300 words or 350 words, and the word count max is 500. And the parents are like, well, there's a lot more that they have to say here. And 500 is the word max. Shouldn't we beef up this essay? And, I find it a little bit funny because I'm like, see, the underlying presumption and assumption there, within that statement, the premise there is that you're presuming that the admissions officers want to read the essay,
Right.
right? They have thousands of essays to read, right? So if you can be succinct and tell a story and have it impact and be memorable and create resonance in 300 words, why are you adding more words to essentially muddy the waters of your narrative?
Right.
So word count doesn't matter. In fact, shorter is actually likely better. It really has to do with human psychology. I had one student give me an essay with one massive paragraph. I think it was like 20 sentences in one paragraph. And I just told him, I'm not reading this. Like, I can't even focus on it. And so it's actually one of the core principles of my of personal statement writing that I tend to tell my students, which is you have to presume that the reader has a short attention span, and you have to give them an opportunity to structure it in their mind so that it's digestible and they feel like they can read it and that they kind of understand what they're getting into. Otherwise, they just look to see if it's of average quality and they go next. So I think that's one of the core myths. Um,
Right.
I guess another myth um, is that the narrative construction has to be like something out of the ordinary or very strange or weird or like you won the Nobel Prize or what have you. In reality, you don't you don't really need much. One of my students, she's an amazing runner. And parents were asking me about her story. I said, one of the biggest part of her stories is she's an elite athlete on top of being an elite um, mind and intellect. And that's good. That's good enough, right? Like you don't have to be like, you know, inventing new narrative arcs that don't really make sense and often just try a little bit too hard. So trying a little less hard, but just being authentic is just saying what's true and really not really fluffing it out to try to fill some void that you think the admissions officer is looking for.
Right. And I feel like that's a huge mistake I personally made on my college application. Like, I feel like my personal narrative, the Common App essay, I didn't really do a great job of being authentic and sounding like myself. Like, I sounded like a programmed, it sounded like a programmed essay or like a scripted out, like, this is what I did,
Mm.
this is why it matters to you. There wasn't really much like emotion or anything in there, which I feel like is important for the authenticity. And like you said, I did try meeting that word count. Like I think I was one word under the maximum, and there was just so much fluff in there that people definitely just got lost in. So that is a really big part. But so, other than the personal narrative, which is one of the most important parts of the college application, another one I think is personally really important is the extracurriculars. because that also gives admissions an idea of who you are as a person because you get to pick out what you do alongside with the personal narrative, and those two things commonly like overlap with each other. So what, like, how do you, at least with your students, recommend they pick out their activities in order to stand out in their application?
Yeah, usually what I do, especially because I primarily work with freshmen and sophomores, I don't really take juniors because at that point their narrative's pretty much baked and the range of outcomes is a bit more narrow. Um, the first thing that I'm looking for is the thing that makes someone's, eyes bulge out and you see that sparkle in their eye when they're talking about it. They can't really stop talking about it. Whatever that is, that's the thing that they should probably be doing and pursuing, in terms of extracurriculars. Yet often that's not really what they do. They join some random club, or if it doesn't, if what they enjoy doing doesn't exist, they don't think to start a club to gather people with similar interests. And so, what I generally try to recommend is that um, you want to be doing things, and this is generally true of more than just admissions. You want to be doing things that you want to do, and you don't want to be doing things you don't want to do. Now, obviously, um, there are stepping stones to things you want that require things that aren't the most fun or enjoyable um, to some. But one of the solutions to that is to develop a taste for winning. And so one of my like core definitions, and I studied philosophy in college, so I really like defining terms and creating, replicable universal formulas of different words. And my universal formula for winning is, and you can ask any of my students and they'll be able to give you this definition, which is doing the things that other people won't or don't do, not necessarily the things that other people can't. Now, if you can do things that other people can't do, more power to you. But really, it's about just doing those things that other people aren't willing to do or won't do or don't do. And that taste for winning actually is what creates lasting motivation, drive, momentum, and makes the extracurricular story actually land as authentic, as opposed to as opposed to contrived.
Right, and like that, like you mentioned, you do better in things that you actually enjoy doing. Like there's, like I was talking in an earlier episode. This was episode 2 with Laura Fortner. We were talking about career exploration. People need to figure out what they're passionate about in order to actually do good in their chosen career choice, and that kind of is the same thing with these activities. Like people aren't going to be able to do their best job or maybe explain it the best if they're not passionate about something and they're just doing, like you said, the random club or what their parents are telling them to do. And like you said, you have to do things that you don't want to do sometimes to achieve the things you want to do. And that kind of brings me to my next point. Like I want to talk a little bit about the academic side because that is something people maybe under like underestimate how important it is in the college admissions process, right? Because there's like,
Yeah.
oh, okay, like I can get my 3.8 GPA, but then have kick-ass activities, kick-ass essay, and then I'll get in wherever I want. That might be true for
Yeah.
some people, depending on how strong your narrative and extracurriculars are. But for the average applicant, those academics are so much more important. So I want you to talk a little bit about maybe the academic side of things, like your GPA, but then also standardized testing and how you maybe prepare your students to take those tests.
Yeah. Academics matter a lot. In fact, part of my process and the reason why I do things a little bit differently than maybe some of the other college admissions coaches and consultants is because I start with only freshmen and sophomores. What I try to actually start with is something I call skill development. I think it was might have been Malcolm Gladwell in either a book or a speech of his that told a story about how there is this international math competition, and at the end of the test, they gave the students a very long survey. I don't know, like 100 questions. And this is probably a game of telephone. I'm probably butchering the story, but hopefully the thrust of it is, kind of lands, which is um, they gave them a long survey and 100 questions. And most students, or many students, were like, okay, I'm not doing the survey. They just kind of finished the test and left. And there were some students who diligently finished the survey, and some did who did kind of like, 30 questions. And they were like, okay, this is too much. And what they found when they regressed those who finished the survey and how many questions they finished versus the how the countries actually scored on the international math competition, the correlation was like very, very high, which essentially means you didn't even have to give them a math test in order to understand whether they're good at math. All you had to do was have them sit down and answer 100 questions that they didn't want to answer. What does that actually say about drive and motivation and effort? I think what it says is, and he made a point about culture. Like in American culture, we often will tell students, "Oh, you're either good at something, you're bad at something." So there are people who think they're good at math, or they're bad at math, or they're good at English, or they're bad at English. And that's completely what I've realized the wrong way to approach it. In other countries, primarily Asian countries, um, they they teach that if you apply more, you might not be great at one thing naturally, but if you apply more effort, you can get better. And so it becomes less a conversation of am I good or bad at something, more less deterministic and more about growth and improvement. And that actually is one of my foundational principles in terms of what I focus on in skill development. I realized that sometimes a student just missed the fractions and percentages unit because they were sick for 2 weeks, in second grade. And now suddenly they've been led to believe that they're bad at math when in reality they just don't know how to add or multiply fractions. And that's led to a massive hole and gap in their foundation. It's hard to learn more advanced math if you don't know how to do fractions, right? Well,
Right.
and so this kind of brings me to a point I think that's really important about academics, and it's like just I'm really big on the principles as opposed to like the specifics, and I think the principles are probably more important anyway, which is this concept of upstream and downstream. What does it mean when something's upstream? It means it's at the highest point. And when something's downstream, it's, kind of the consequence or result of a lot of intermediary events and so when something's more upstream, right? If you fix a problem that's more upstream, you tend to actually address future potential problems right at the root, right? It's like solving the root problem. And so with skill development, what I realized was the most upstream thing that you can find in academics that correlates, in my opinion, and I don't know if there are any studies or anything, but I've seen it anecdotally and I've also applied it with great success. That grammar, English grammar, is actually the most upstream academic skill that translates into broader success, regardless of where your interests ultimately lie. Think about it this way. Every profession is gatekept by language. If you don't understand the building blocks of your own language, you won't be able to know what you're reading when you're reading it. You'll be a poor communicator, and ultimately you'll be gatekept out of professions simply because you cannot communicate properly. Language is the foundation of everything, and what I found is the students that were scoring 1500, 1600 on their SATs and getting great grades, they share all this. It's crazy. They share this one thing in common. They were as good, if not better than me at grammar. And that's when it kind of really hit me that if you solve the grammar problem, which for whatever reason, I don't know if they don't teach it. I don't know if it was a kind of combination of COVID issues and listening to books instead of reading them. But there are so many students who are definitionally, by definition, illiterate, which means essentially that you might be able to speak English, but you can't necessarily read or write it with any effectiveness. And so solving that problem, I've found, has led to massive jumps in reading speeds, massive jumps in ability to learn, ability to abstract, ability to communicate. And ultimately, it's really hard to help students get into elite colleges if they can't read or write. And so academics actually starts with the fundamentals during freshman and sophomore year when things matter a little bit less. That's when you should be upping your vocabulary, getting to elite levels of grammar. And I like to use old SAT grammar sections. Back when I was taking the SAT, they had an entire writing/grammar section. They don't do that anymore. And part of the reason they don't do that anymore, by the way, just a side note, is because you know, it looks bad if students are not so great at it, so they make the test easier, and that's what they've been
Right.
doing.
Yeah.
But if you have an absolute standard, that shouldn't matter. And so my standards are absolute, and I think it's very, very important to be as upstream of all the potential downstream things that you might encounter, including, by the way, foreign languages. Like if you also look at my students, the ones who have really bad Spanish and French scores and grades, they happen to also have very low percentile in English grammar. Go figure, right? So academics for me, when I try to kind of focus on the foundation, is really about foundational core skills. And so that's grammar, that's percentages, that's fractions, that's deductive reasoning. Having logic puzzles, things I call perplexers, which are these small logic puzzles designed for high school students to actually learn how to use process of elimination. And then just kind of broader mental models of reasoning. to be able to be analytical and analytic in terms of how you look at problems and how you solve them. So I'm really trying to actually address things that are more than just college admissions, and in doing that, I actually help create a really well-rounded academically applicant for college admissions.
That's actually really interesting because I would have never thought that grammar or like maybe percentages or fractions would have to do with like AP calculus or like even like your science classes or whatever. Like those core skills are really important because I remember like at least for me, like this might not be as basic as you're talking about, but because my COVID year was seventh grade, eighth grade, and that was what algebra one and pre-algebra for me. And I, because it was COVID, I was not really paying the most attention. But then I got to high school, took honors geometry, took honors algebra two, and then I was like getting 70s on tests, and I was just like, damn, like I really do need the
Yeah.
basics. And that really shows how important that is. So I kind of want to get into because you brought up how some kids' grammar might be taking a hit because of listening to books instead of reading them. So that kind of takes me into the introduction of AI into our everyday lives, right? Because as we know, AI is a very powerful tool and can write essays, can outline essays, it can do our work for us. So how is that real? Like, is that having, sorry, is that having an impact on maybe college applicants today? Like, do you see people writing essays with AI or trying to figure out their applications with AI? And if so, is that really hurting them?
Yeah, I do see it. The way I think about AI, it's like any technology, and this is tale as old as time. Um, think of AI or any new technology that makes people's lives easier as essentially like money. If you're generous already, more money makes you more generous. If
Right,
you're greedy, more money makes you more greedy. With technology and AI, if you want to learn something, if you genuinely love to learn and want to learn, AI is one of the best tools to help you learn. It can
right,
accelerate learning dramatically. If you don't want to learn, AI is one of the best crutches and will almost nearly guarantee that you don't learn a thing in your life for the rest of your life. Um, that's an exaggeration. But what I've noticed is it's exactly true. It's really not about the tool itself. It's sort of like spell check, right? If a spell check, if you all you have to type to spell the word guarantee is GRNT and it automatically autocorrects your word into the word guarantee, well, guess what? You don't know how to spell the word guarantee,
right,
right? And so there's a time and place for everything. I think AI is a great tool once you understand how to actually do the things and think in ways that are more about synthesis than analysis and are less machine-like, because then you can actually, flex that muscle of creativity to your advantage. And so with AI in the college application, I think it actually will come at the expense, if it's overused, at the expense of authenticity. So I think in a way, it's actually a competitive advantage not to use it. um, Using it for outlines is fine for ideation and idea generation, insight generation. Sure, I think that's great. Using it to write, it's pretty obvious to me when something's AI. Um,
right.
that's just me. Some people's pattern recognition aren't as strong, but as you know, for me, I think it's pretty obvious when I hear someone's voice versus when I hear an AI.
Right. That kind of eliminates that authenticity or that personal touch, maybe to your narrative or your explanations for your extracurriculars, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So we're running out of time for today's episode, but I do want to get your one final piece of advice for anyone maybe heading into the college admissions process this year or maybe freshmen, sophomores, juniors. Like, what is one crucial piece of advice that everyone needs to know before getting into this process?
Yeah, I think I'd probably direct it toward freshmen and sophomores. I'm sorry, juniors and seniors, but like, you know, you kind of have your bed and you have to lay in it. But with freshmen and sophomores, I'd say, and it's something that I do in my process, when you're instead of just writing your goals down, actually write them down in the present tense as if they've already been achieved. And I guess what do I mean by that? Um, it's this exercise I do with my students where, and part of my goal discovery process, where I basically say, just fast forward a few years and presume that you've just been accepted into your dream school, Harvard, Yale, MIT, Stanford, whatever it is. Then ask yourself what happened. Tell that story and put together that narrative. And what you'll find is that you're automatically starting to see and create realistic stepping stones that get you toward that goal. Because if you just presume that you've already gotten it, then you have to kind of back into, well, what did I do to get there? I must have gotten a really high SAT score. I must have, had stellar grades. I must have won a national essay competition or been shortlisted in a couple. I must have gotten a gold key in the Scholastic. Maybe I won, a public speaking award regionally in FBLA. I don't know, whatever the case may be. It's putting together that story. And what is that process really? It's setting goals. And it's far more effective than just saying, okay, kids, now go set some goals. So that's the one thing I would say about goal setting and goal discovery. Put together your stats in the present tense as if they've already happened by fast forwarding to the future, and that will actually accelerate your ability to discover your own narrative and the potential paths that you can take to get to your dream school.
Awesome. Yeah. So, all right, guys, that's a wrap for today's episode of Dear Gen Z. I hope this conversation gave you a clearer and more strategic perspective on how to approach the college admissions process, and maybe even took away some of the stress around it if you're getting into it. Huge thanks to Josh today for pulling back the curtain on what really matters and sharing such valuable insider advice. If you found this episode helpful, be sure to follow the podcast, share it with a friend who's applying to college, and leave a quick review. It helps us reach more Gen Z listeners who need this kind of guidance. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.